June 5, 1944. Field Marshal Erwin Rommel climbed into his staff car outside Paris, holding a small package wrapped in paper. Inside, gray suede shoes, size 512. A birthday present for his wife Lucy, whose 50th birthday was tomorrow, June 6th. Outside, rain lashed the windows. Wind howled across northern France. The weather was impossible. No invasion could come in conditions like this. German meteorologists had issued their forecast: bad weather for at least 2 weeks. Rommel hadn't seen his wife in months. He'd been working 18-hour days, driving himself relentlessly, inspecting every bunker along 800 miles of French coastline. He deserved 1 day off. What Rommel didn't know was that in the next 36 hours, everything he'd predicted would come true. The Allies would land. Germany would have exactly 24 hours to stop them. And he would be 600 kilometers away, watching his wife open a pair of shoes while the largest military operation in human history unfolded on the beaches he was supposed to be defending. 6 weeks earlier, standing on a deserted Normandy beach, Rommel had turned to his aide, Captain Helmuth Lang, and pointed his marshal's baton at the sand. "The war will be won or lost on the beaches," he declared. "We'll have only one chance to stop the enemy, while he's in the water, struggling to get ashore. The main line of resistance must be here, right at the water's edge." He paused, staring at the gray English Channel. "Believe me, Lang, the first 24 hours of the invasion will be decisive. The fate of Germany depends on the outcome." He gripped his baton tighter. "For the Allies as well as Germany, it will be the longest day." Rommel understood what his superiors refused to accept. Once the Allies established a beachhead, once they got tanks and artillery ashore, once they linked their landing zones together, Germany would never dislodge them. The only chance was to destroy the invasion in its first hours, while soldiers were wading through surf, while landing craft were grinding onto sand, while everything was chaos and vulnerability. 24 hours. That was the window. After that, the war in the West would be lost. The problem was that almost no one in the German High Command agreed with him. Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt was 68 years old, supreme commander in the West, and he had a very different vision. Rundstedt believed in classic mobile defense. Let the Allies land. Let them commit their forces. Then unleash the panzer divisions in a massive counterattack that would drive them back into the sea. This was orthodox German thinking. Keep the armored reserves concentrated around Paris, ready to strike once the invasion's true location became clear. Rommel thought this was suicide. He'd fought the British and Americans in North Africa for 2 years. He'd felt the devastating power of Allied air superiority firsthand. He'd watched his supply convoys bombed to wreckage, his tank columns strafed until roads were littered with burning vehicles. He knew what happened when the enemy controlled the skies. Any armored reserve held inland would be destroyed from the air long before reaching the coast. The panzers had to be positioned close to the beaches, ready to counterattack within hours, not days. Every moment of delay would give the Allies time to consolidate. Every mile the tanks traveled in daylight would cost vehicles and men. If the tanks were still near Paris when Allied soldiers hit the sand, they might as well not exist. The two field marshals argued for months. Neither would yield. Their staffs clashed repeatedly. The command structure became a tangle of conflicting authorities, because neither could convince the other, and because Hitler trusted neither completely, the final decision went to the Führer himself. Hitler's solution was a compromise that satisfied no one. He split the armored forces. 3 panzer divisions went to Rommel near the coast. 3 went to southern France. 4 of the best, including the elite 12th SS Panzer Division Hitler Jugend, were held in Central Reserve. But here was the fatal catch. The reserve divisions could not move without Hitler's personal authorization, not Rundstedt's approval, not Rommel's request. Only the Führer himself could release the panzers. The order had to come from Hitler's lips, no matter where he was, no matter what time it was, no matter what else was happening. When the invasion came, the most powerful armored force in France would be paralyzed until one man in a Bavarian mountain retreat decided to wake up and give the order. Rommel knew this was madness. He protested repeatedly. He traveled to Berchtesgaden to argue personally. He demanded control of the armored reserves. Hitler wouldn't budge. So Rommel did what he could with the forces he controlled. What Rommel accomplished in 6 months before D-Day was remarkable. When he first arrived in November 1943, the Atlantic Wall was a fiction, impressive on paper, hollow in reality. Entire stretches of coastline had no obstacles, no mines, no concrete bunkers. Rommel threw himself into the work with furious energy. He was up at 4:30 every morning, inspecting every sector personally, driving thousands of kilometers, demanding progress. To his engineer, he outlined what he wanted. I want anti-personnel mines, anti-tank mines, anti-paratroop mines. I want mines to sink ships and mines to sink landing craft. I want 50 million mines planted along the coast. It was an impossible number. By June, they'd placed 5 million. Under his direction, more than 4,600 new fortifications were erected in just 4 months. 500,000 obstacles were placed on the beaches, steel hedgehogs that could rip out a landing craft's bottom, wooden stakes topped with mines, massive Belgian gates. He flooded low-lying areas to trap paratroopers. He planted fields with sharpened poles. Troops called them Rommel's asparagus, topped with artillery shells. Gliders trying to land would be torn apart. He positioned artillery to create overlapping fields of fire. He strengthened concrete bunkers. He installed machine gun nests with interlocking arcs. Rommel turned the Normandy coast into a death trap, but it wasn't enough. It would never be enough. He'd wanted 50 million mines. He got a tenth of that. He'd wanted the panzer divisions at the water's edge. They remained miles inland, waiting for orders that would have to come from Hitler. Time was the enemy Rommel couldn't defeat. In late May, he spoke to a division commander. If we cannot defeat the enemy in the first hours, we will not defeat him at all. Everything depends on stopping them at the water's edge. Once they establish themselves ashore, it's over. In the first week of June, the weather turned foul. Storms lashed the coast. Seas were too rough for any landing operation. German meteorologists issued their forecast. Bad weather for at least 2 weeks. Rommel made his decision. He would go home, celebrate Lucy's birthday on June 6th, then travel to Berchtesgaden to meet Hitler on June 7th. One more chance to convince the Führer to release the panzer reserves. On the morning of June 5th, his chief of staff bid him farewell. The weather was miserable, exactly as predicted. No invasion could come in conditions like this. Except there was something the German meteorologists couldn't see. The Allies had captured weather stations in the North Atlantic that Germany had lost. They had data from ships and aircraft the Germans didn't have. And that data showed a brief window of acceptable weather opening on the morning of June 6th. General Dwight Eisenhower had already postponed the invasion one day because of storms. His fleet was at sea, 156,000 men on thousands of ships. They couldn't stay there indefinitely. At 4:15 a.m. on June 5th, Eisenhower's chief meteorologist delivered the forecast. The weather would clear enough on June 6th to permit the invasion. The window would be brief. The seas would still be rough, but it would be good enough. Eisenhower sat in silence. The weight of the decision was crushing. "Okay," he said quietly. "We'll go." While Rommel drove through Germany toward his home, 5,000 ships were churning across the English Channel. 11,000 aircraft were preparing for the greatest air operation in history. The first warning came shortly after midnight. American and British paratroopers began dropping into Normandy. They were scattered by winds, landing miles from intended zones. Some drowned in flooded fields. but thousands survived and began organizing. At Château La Roche-Guyon, Rommel's chief of staff, Hans Speidel, received fragmentary, confusing reports. Paratroopers were landing. But where? How many? Was this the real invasion or a feint? The confusion was intentional. Dummy parachutists, fabric figures with firecrackers, had been dropped to spread chaos. German commanders couldn't tell which reports were real. At Field Marshal von D. Rundstedt's headquarters near Paris, the staff was uncertain. Was this the real invasion or a diversion? Operation Fortitude, the elaborate Allied deception, had convinced German intelligence the main blow would fall at Pas-de-Calais, not Normandy. Even now, many German commanders believed this was just a feint. Meanwhile, a German intelligence officer was listening to a radio intercept that should have told them everything. The BBC had broadcast coded lines from a Paul Verlaine poem to the French resistance. Long sobs of autumn's violins wound my heart with monotonous languor. German intelligence knew this poem would signal the invasion. The first 3 lines broadcast on June 1st meant invasion within 2 weeks. The second half broadcast on June 5th meant invasion within 48 hours. Lieutenant Colonel Helmuth Meyer rushed to inform General Hans von Salmuth, commander of the 15th Army, who was playing bridge. Salmuth ordered his troops to full alert, then turned back to his cards. "I'm too old a bunny to get excited by this," he said. Crucially, the 7th Army, responsible for the Normandy sector where the actual invasion was occurring, was not alerted. The message went to the wrong army. And at the Berghof, Hitler's mountain retreat, no one did anything at all. Hitler had stayed up late watching newsreels. He retired around 3 a.m. His personal physician had given him sleeping pills. When the first reports reached German high command, the Führer was sound asleep, and no one dared wake him. General Alfred Jodl, chief of operations, received urgent calls throughout the early morning. The reports were alarming. This wasn't a small raid. Thousands of paratroopers had landed. Naval radar detected massive ship movements. Rundstedt wanted to release the armored reserves immediately. He'd already ordered 2 panzer divisions to move toward Normandy on his own authority. But he knew he'd exceeded his powers. Only Hitler could authorize Panzer Group West reserves. Jodl hesitated. He wasn't convinced Normandy was the main attack. He still believed Pas-de-Calais was the real target, and even if this was the main invasion, he couldn't authorize the panzers on his own. Only Hitler could do that. Jodl decided not to wake the Führer. The situation would become clearer by daylight. Better to wait, to gather more information, to be certain. While Jodl waited and Hitler slept, the first waves of Allied infantry were approaching the beaches. At 6:30 a.m., the seaborne landings began. American soldiers hit Utah and Omaha beaches. British and Canadian troops stormed Gold, Juno, and Sword beaches. The Atlantic Wall, the fortress that was supposed to hold for years, was being breached in a single morning. At Utah Beach, the landings went almost miraculously well. Strong currents pushed landing craft south of the intended beach, which proved fortunate. The actual landing zone was less defended. At Omaha Beach, it was carnage. High bluffs overlooked the sand. German positions created murderous crossfire. The preliminary bombardment had done little damage. Many amphibious tanks sank in rough seas. The first waves walked into a killing ground. Machine gun fire cut them down. Bodies littered the waterline. For hours, the outcome hung in the balance. General Omar Bradley considered evacuating the beach, but the Americans didn't break. Small groups led by sergeants and lieutenants found ways up the bluffs. They blew gaps in wire. They silenced bunkers. By noon, they'd gained footholds. At British and Canadian beaches, specialized armored vehicles helped breach defenses. By afternoon, British troops were pushing toward Caen. And still no one woke Hitler. And still the panzers didn't move. When Hitler finally woke around 10 a.m., the invasion was already 4 hours old. He received his first full briefing at 11:30. Even then, he was skeptical. He believed Normandy was a diversion. The real attack would come at Pas-de-Calais. He refused to release the armored reserves. His generals presented evidence. This was clearly a major operation. Tens of thousands of troops were already ashore. The scale of naval and air support was unprecedented. Hitler wouldn't budge. The Normandy attack was a feint. He wouldn't be tricked. Hour after hour passed. The Allies poured men and equipment onto beaches. German defenders, without armored support, fought desperately but couldn't throw invaders back. It wasn't until 2 p.m., nearly 8 hours after landings began, that Hitler finally authorized release of 2 panzer divisions. By then, it was far too late. The tanks had to move in daylight, exactly as Rommel predicted. Allied aircraft controlled the skies. Thousands of fighter bombers were flying support missions. The moment German armor moved, they were spotted and attacked. Panzer Lehr Division, one of Germany's finest, lost 5 tanks, 84 half-tracks, and over 130 trucks before ever reaching the front. Only one Panzer Division managed to counterattack on D-Day itself. The 21st Panzer was positioned near Caen, close enough to respond without traveling far. But even the 21st Panzer was paralyzed by command chaos. Its commander was absent, reportedly in Paris. No one could give orders to attack. When he finally returned, the division still couldn't move. It needed Rommel's authorization, but Rommel was in Germany. It wasn't until nearly noon that authorization came. By then, the division was ordered to attack in the wrong direction, first toward Caen Center, then redirected north. The tanks had to thread through rubble-strewn streets, wasting hours. It was late afternoon before the 21st Panzer finally attacked toward Sword Beach. They pushed through a gap between British and Canadian beachheads, actually reaching the sea. For a brief moment, German tanks were on the Normandy beaches. But without infantry support, without reinforcements, without coordinated follow-up, they couldn't hold. Then around 9 p.m., nearly 600 Allied transport aircraft thundered overhead, carrying reinforcements to British airborne troops. The German commander, watching the massive air armada, panicked. He believed his forces were about to be cut off by a new airborne landing. He ordered a retreat. The aircraft were actually heading away from his position. There was no threat of encirclement, but he didn't know that. The only German armored counterattack of D-Day ended in withdrawal. While all this happened, Rommel was still in Germany. Speidel had called him early in the morning with news of landings. Rommel immediately prepared to return to France. But the journey would take hours. He couldn't fly. Allied aircraft controlled the skies. Any German plane would be shot down. He had to drive 600 kilometers on roads that might be targeted by Allied bombers. Rommel spent D-Day in his car, racing toward Normandy, listening to fragmentary radio reports of disaster unfolding. There was nothing he could do. Every decision that mattered was made without him. Every opportunity slipped away while he was on the road. By the time he arrived at La Roche-Guyon that evening, tens of thousands of Allied troops were already ashore. The 5 beachheads were beginning to link up. The Atlantic Wall had been pierced in a single day. Rommel understood immediately what this meant. He'd said it himself. The first 24 hours would be decisive. Those 24 hours were now over. The Allies had not been thrown back. They'd gained a foothold. From that foothold, they would never be dislodged. "How stupid of me," Rommel muttered. "How stupid of me." He'd been away when it mattered most. He'd trusted the weather forecasters. He'd gone to give his wife a pair of gray suede shoes while his soldiers died without their commander. In the days that followed, Rommel fought with everything he had. He rushed reinforcements. He personally visited forward positions, rallying troops, directing counterattacks. But it was all a holding action now. The moment for victory had passed. The window had closed. By June 12th, the Allied beachheads had merged into a continuous front 80 kilometers wide. More than 326,000 troops were in France, with more arriving every day. Rommel met with Hitler on June 17th. He tried to explain the reality. The front couldn't hold. The Allies had overwhelming superiority. Every day the situation grew worse. Germany should seek a political solution, Rommel argued. The war in the West was lost. Hitler refused to listen. He ranted about wonder weapons. He insisted the Wehrmacht hold without retreat. He would hear nothing of negotiation or surrender. Rommel left knowing Hitler had lost touch with reality. On July 17th, returning from the front, Rommel's staff car was strafed by Allied fighters. The driver was killed. Rommel was thrown from the car with severe head injuries, his skull fractured in 3 places. His war was over. 3 days later, German officers attempted to assassinate Hitler with a bomb. Hitler survived. The Gestapo launched a massive investigation. Rommel's name came up during interrogations. Several conspirators mentioned him. The evidence was fragmentary, but Hitler had heard enough. On October 14th, 2 generals arrived at Rommel's home with an ultimatum: face trial and public hanging, disgracing his family and staff, or take poison. If he chose suicide, he'd receive a state funeral. His family would be protected. Rommel called his 15-year-old son Manfred to his side. "To die at the hands of one's own people is hard," he said, "but the house is surrounded, and Hitler is charging me with high treason." He went upstairs to say goodbye to Lucy. "I will die in 15 minutes. He put on his Afrika Korps jacket, took his field marshal's baton, and walked out. 20 minutes later, the phone rang. Field Marshal Rommel had died. The Nazi regime announced Rommel had died of war wounds. He was given a lavish state funeral. Hitler sent a wreath praising his service. The German people mourned a hero. They didn't know their hero had been murdered by the regime he served. History remembers D-Day as a triumph. And it was. The courage of Allied soldiers was extraordinary. The planning was a masterpiece. The deception operations were brilliant. But D-Day was also a story of German failure. Failure of intelligence, command, and decision. The defenders had the forces to stop the invasion: soldiers, tanks, artillery. What they lacked was the ability to use them in time. Rommel had seen it all coming. He'd understood the first 24 hours would be decisive. He'd begged for authority to mass forces at the water's edge, to position panzers close enough to counterattack immediately. He'd warned that any delay would be fatal. He'd predicted armored reserves would be destroyed from the air before reaching battle. And then on the one day when his presence was most critical, he was 600 kilometers away. Because weather forecasters said no invasion was possible. Because the Germans intercepted the coded warning but sent it to the wrong army. Because Hitler slept through crucial hours when panzers could have been unleashed. Because his staff wouldn't wake him. Because Jodl decided to wait, to gather more information, to be certain. By the time Hitler was awake and briefed and finally convinced, the opportunity had passed. 24 hours. That was all Germany had. Rommel had said it plainly, standing on that empty beach in April, waving his marshal's baton at the sand. The first 24 hours will be decisive. The fate of Germany depends on the outcome. For the Allies as well as Germany, it will be the longest day. He was right. And because the German High Command couldn't act decisively in those 24 hours, because Hitler wouldn't release the panzers, because no one would wake the Führer, because Rommel himself was away for a birthday party. The invasion succeeded. Within 11 months, Germany had surrendered unconditionally. Adolf Hitler was dead in a Berlin bunker. The 1,000-year Reich had lasted 12 years. Some moments cannot be recovered. Some opportunities once missed never return. The first 24 hours of D-Day were such a moment. Germany let that chance slip away, and the longest day became the beginning of the end.